Alrighty, recording here for Pod30. This will be continuing Plato's Phaedo. So, again, the sort of structure of what we're doing here in Page of Plato, you can think of it as essentially slow reads through Platonic dialogues and really taking the time to chew on all the details, the little nuances. Perhaps I haven't chewed on every detail to the nth degree of detail, but certainly getting to a lot of points that, frankly, if I was doing 50-minute lectures within the context of a semester-long course where you need to essentially run through Plato in about half a semester, then these the podcast lengths, as far as being comparable lectures to what would be done in the classroom, is not really the case. We're getting an opportunity to dive a lot deeper into the material, and in a way we're also doing a little bit less of high level thought out analysis where we're consistently hitting home tons of points in kind of a ideological way, just to say that we're trying to persuade people of a certain idea. I think you've seen I've talked about Socratic irony a bunch, what epistemic ignorance means, consists of, etc. But I'm trying to do those while remaining sort of in the sphere of kind of trying to take the text as it is and not trying to necessarily, read all of Plato into every sentence of Plato. You want to consider the individual sections in themselves. Then obviously it's good to have context of knowledge of other dialogues, etc., so that you can approach each dialogue with that context and just a bit of broader understanding of how Plato tends to do things, how he depicts Socrates, and questions that can be raised about the, let's say, historical fidelity of these accounts, as far as whether they are accounts or whether they're more hypothetical discussions that may or may not have happened, but the historicity is arguably not as relevant as, let's say, the ideological consequences of the arguments. So we're talking about Plato's Phaedo today, and we're starting from 60D. And just here at the beginning, I guess I'll mention this since I didn't get to it till about 20 minutes in last time, but again, I'm on the third novella of the Dunk and Egg novellas of the Night of the Seven Kingdoms, those three little novels by George R. R. Martin, and they are fantastic. And it seems like Dunk is trying to get to the wall for some reason, and then all the stuff they're doing with the Blackfire rebellions and stuff, very good, very much coloring the world with something that I had never really paid the most amount of attention to. So, with that in mind, though, we're going to proceed with our close reads of Phaedo, and we're going to start at 60D, since that's where we left off last time. And again, where we left off was basically, they bring Socrates out. We talked at the beginning quickly in this first episode on Phaedo about how this dialogue is secondhand, in the sense that not only was Plato not present for this, but also in terms of the as a story, it is presented as Echecrates asking Phaedo about Socrates' last days and tell us the story, don't leave out any details, blah blah blah. So you be you about what you think the consequences of that is, but important to note, and then frankly not even the most important, so it kind of gets swept away eventually. And some of the foreigners present, Simmias of Thebes, Cebes, they're going to be important members of this discussion. And then what happens is they go to Socrates to visit him, and they had just let him out of his shackles, and so he basically, it's almost like he makes a joke to his friends, which is, on the one hand, lighthearted, on the other hand, is arguably slightly insensitive, although as the person going to be executed, it's maybe hard to say he's being insensitive. What's he being insensitive to himself? But then it's really like, oh, he's being insensitive to the feelings of his fellows, his wife, his children, whoever it may happen to be. But then, so after Socrates sends his wife Xanthippe and their baby home, and then he's able to kind of freely talk to the homies, which, kind of this interesting phenomenon. I'm sure other people have experienced something like this, where somebody's spouse goes away and all of a sudden that person reemerges, as opposed to the sort of duty-bound whatever it is that a person ends up being as a family member, and a person creating their own family in that sense of having a child. So then, Socrates basically makes a remark about the fact that after being let out of his shackles, he is experiencing pleasure, which is following upon him being in pain from being in the shackles. And he remarks on sort of the relation between pain and pleasure, that, you pursue the one, catch it, almost always gonna catch the other also. So that, builds into Plato's sort of theory of happiness, and idea that, basically happiness can't be purely of pursuing pleasure, because, again, it causes pain in some ways. Classic example would be, you eat something and it's pleasant, but you're eating something arguably to avoid sort of the pain of hunger, and arguably the pain of hunger is what really prompts you to eat the food. And then, if you didn't eat the food, again, your hunger would be worse, and then your pain would be worse. But then you eat the food, you're temporarily sustained, but then you have to go eat again, and it creates a never-ending cycle where you're always on the rat wheel and you can't get off of it. And so that is sort of more along the lines of like a Buddhist, or somebody just trying to basically argue that existence is suffering, and the point of enlightenment is basically escaping the bonds of existence. We'll see that Socrates and Plato are sort of hinting along these lines, not necessarily concluding that far along those lines, but something close to it, where they're pointing out that, pain and pleasure, when you basically take pleasure, there's always aspects of pain sort of associated, whether it's causally or sort of just, almost like coincidentally every time. So there's not actually a cause and effect relationship. There really is just a true correlation, not a causation between their relation. But this is where a religion like Christianity will come into the picture and sort of take these ideas to a different level, where they will say, well, the material world is full of sin and pain and all these various things, and therefore you're wanting to overcome your alienation from God and live in a more godly way, so that you can be in closer accord to kind of the way that you ought to live, and therefore not riding so much the train of pleasure and pain as much as just trying to do the right thing. And that again is sort of the power of the idea of, the bread of life, everlasting life, and these sorts of ideas, because when you analyze it down to its roots, when you consider happiness as, I'm a jug and I pour things into myself and, that's how I sustain myself, then there's the metaphor of sort of the leaky tub, where you've got a leak and therefore you're constantly shedding water while trying to take it on, trying to keep the tub filled, and you don't even realize that what you're doing is counterproductive, etc., etc. You've not really addressed the leak, all these sorts of things. So that's just to throw that out there. And I say that the food example in particular, because if you look at Epicurus, as I do, as a real extension of these Platonic ideas to a lot of their kind of logical extremes under a more materialistic framework, I think what Epicurus is basically saying, if you understand the ataraxia sort of ideology, it's, understanding what desires are natural, necessary, which ones are unnatural, unnecessary, which ones are natural, unnecessary, which ones are unnatural, unnecessary, etc., and then having an ability to adhere to the things that are natural and necessary without indulging too much in what's unnatural or what is unnecessary. And the kind of concrete example of how you say take this sort of Epicurus philosophy, and it's not a complete version of the ethos of this, but just another example. It's like, just eat like a thing of, cheese and bread. And why is that? Well, it's not terribly fatty and horrendous for you, etc. You'll be able to eat that consistently over time. You mix in a few other things, you get your necessities, but you're not doing the thing that, I think a lot of people in our modern American culture can, and it's kind of terrible thinking about it to understand that this is such a common experience, but like the idea that you have a thing of potato chips or Doritos, whatever you eat, and then, you thought you were going to have a few chips, and then you look over and the bag's gone. That's an example of something where that's something that not only is it unnatural in the sense that it's artificial and created. I don't think that's what they mean by unnatural anyway, but you look at it and you definitely say, well, all of that eating was not necessary, therefore some of the eating was unnecessary, and then you're causing yourself pain because, you're going to have an upset stomach, or the health results as far as what it is you ate and the consequences of that. And so there's this interesting thing to note that Socrates is basically noting right here at the beginning of the dialogue, that pleasure and pain are not necessarily the way people tend to think of them, which is kind of a overall sort of Platonic, Socratic sort of thing, is that people are like kind of wrongly oriented on a lot of things they think they know about, but truly don't. And I guess what he's saying, people think pleasure is the good, and even if pleasure ends up being the good, as I will argue that Plato gets to that point in, I think it's in Protagoras, might have been Gorgias, but in one of those dialogues I would argue that Plato basically gives up the game and admits that pleasure is the good, but then he just goes to the point in saying, well, it's pleasure properly defined. It's pleasure as actual pleasure, not apparent pleasure, but the thing that's actually beneficial to you, and therefore, very different from the common misunderstanding that people will tend to have and that people will tend to follow, because people are in general not wise and frankly don't adhere to anything like a sort of Socratic framework of thinking things through. So we have Socrates just mentioning basically how strange what pleasure is, the relation with it, and it's what's thought to be its opposite, namely pain. My bonds cause pain in my leg, now pleasure seems to be following. When man has the one, the other follows later. So that idea is another sort of consequence of that idea, is basically Socrates is saying, well, if you're in pain, you're in luck, because that probably means some sort of pleasure is coming around the bend, and vice versa. If you're having pleasure, some sort of pain is coming around the bend, and that having that perspective in both circumstances helps to ground you and prepare you for what may or may not happen. And so Cebes intervened and said, "By Zeus, yes, Socrates, you did well to remind me. Venus asked me the day before yesterday, as others had done before, what induced you to write poetry after you came to prison, you who had never composed any poetry before, putting the fables of Aesop into verse and composing the hymn to Apollo. If it is of any concern to you that I should have an answer to give to Venus when he repeats his question, as I know he will, tell me what to say to him." So, interesting here. Cebes is pointing out something that I don't think we, unless he says it at the beginning of Phaedo, which I am going to take a quick peek back and see if at the beginning Socrates mentions writing poetry. No, I don't think he mentions that the other time. So this is where it is mentioned that he's writing poetry after coming to prison, had never composed poetry before, fables of Aesop into verse, composing the hymn to Apollo. So, I don't need to wallop you over the head again with the notion that when Socrates is doing things that have relation to Apollo, that he's clearly in a worshipful sort of relation to Apollo. He clearly worships Apollo, and that's why you can take sort of the Nietzschean point that Greek philosophy is Apollonian in some sense. And then also fables of Aesop. I'm not even gonna look up Aesop, and the barnyard animal is the first thing that runs through my mind, like goat or some shit like that, which I don't know why that's running through my head, but I'm just assuming Aesop had some more rustic fables or something to make me have that association, but I don't even care, to be honest. Like, no offense to Socrates, but he's writing poetry and good for him, but I don't care that much. So we just want to note this and then kind of move on. Not spend too much time on that. So I'm gonna flip forward to the next page. Tell him the truth, Cebes, he said, that I did not do this with the idea of rivaling him in his poems, for I knew that would not be easy, but I tried to find out the meaning of certain dreams and satisfy my conscience, in case it was this kind of art they were frequently bidding me to practice. Dreams were something like this. Same dream often came to me in the past, now in one shape, now in another, but saying the same thing. Socrates, it said, practice and cultivate the arts. In the past, I imagined that it was instructing and advising me to do what I was doing, such as those who encourage a runner in a race, and that the dream was thus bidding me to do the very thing I was doing, namely to practice the art of philosophy, this being the highest kind of art, and I was doing that. But now, after my trial took place and the festival of the god was preventing my execution, I thought that, in case my dream was bidding me to practice this popular art, I should not disobey it, but compose poetry. I thought it safer not to leave here until I satisfied my conscience by writing poems in obedience to the dream. So I first wrote in honor of the god of the present festival. After that, I realized that a poet, if he is to be a poet, must compose fables, not arguments. Being no teller of fables myself, I took the stories I knew and had at hand, the fables of Aesop, and I versified the first ones I came across. Tell this to Venus, Cebes, wish him well, and bid him farewell. Tell him, if he is wise, to follow me as soon as possible. I am leaving today, it seems, as the Athenians so order it. So, we're gonna chew on these two paragraphs here, because there's a lot here, and to be honest, I don't know how much farther we're going to get beyond the next page in this episode, since there's a lot of stuff here, and the comment that Socrates made at the very end is super loaded when he says, if he's wise, to follow me as soon as possible. I guess this is sort of where people come up with that silly discussion topic of, in philosophy, basically, is life worth living? If not, should you kill yourself? Which is it's a loaded fucking thing to say, and you can definitely say that that's what Socrates is implying. And then again, that goes to the Socratic irony thing. How much do you think he's saying these things to sort of shock people and this, that, and the other, and how much is he saying these things because he literally thinks, well, tell Venus, like, tell him to, not to kill himself, but to die as soon as possible, because, there's all sorts of benefits to it and blah, 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 which again, this is why I think it's a slight bit of a problem to tell somebody else what you think about death in the afterlife, because, that it's just it's a loaded thing that Socrates said, and so clearly we need to chew on those paragraphs a bit in order to fully understand what he said and what he's talking about. So, first, tell him, Venus, I'm not trying to rival his poems. I know that's not easy, but he says, I tried to find out the meaning of certain dreams and to satisfy my conscience in case it was this kind of art they were frequently bidding me to practice. So, again here, remember in the past I've said in some of our discussions that Socrates may be an epileptic, he may be autistic, he may have Asperger's syndrome, he may have this, that, and the other thing. And to be fair, I haven't really defined what those sort of neurodivergent things are. I've only made sort of allusions to them as ideas, but basically, this is one of the things that you can point to and you can say, well, no matter how rational Socrates is, this is one of the weaker sort of legs that he has to stand on from an ideological perspective, is just the fact that he's trying to interpret dreams. And I don't say this to be rude, because again, judging somebody who's about to be executed, who's in this state, it's not necessarily fair. It's not necessarily in a spirit of kindness, etc. But I think I would say this, generally speaking, if you or anybody else are trying to interpret your dreams or anybody else's dreams, I would encourage you to stop. And the reason why is because they're essentially irrational. You explaining where your dreams come from is unlikely at best, in my opinion. In other words, you can make some argument that maybe somebody like Socrates with his obvious intellectual gifts is going to be able to interpret the dream in the best way possible. But again, I think general experience tells us when people start interpreting dreams, you've got to view that as a red flag of some kind, whether or not it's a red flag and, they slow down, wave them through, whatever it is. But something to think about and ponder is that, the basis of a lot of Socrates' behavior as he's reporting it to people has to do with dream interpretation. And you can look at works like Hobbes' Leviathan. You read the first few sections and you get his sort of materialistic framework of the universe, and then his sort of idea that your dreams are more so analogous to like the ripples on a pond that occur when you throw a rock into it. In other words, they're just the effects of things that have happened earlier on, whether they're sense impressions or anything else. And you sort of combine that with a Humean sort of idea that the human mind is able to take disparate elements that have never been intuited in the real world, meaning like you can combine the concepts of gold and mountain and have an imaginary understanding of what it would constitute to have an object that was a mountain made of gold, a literal mountain made of literal gold, meaning the literal substance, the element of gold, and the entire mountain is composed of gold to the sort of chemical extent that gold is typically gold in, natural occurring circumstances. And then you clearly sort of can point out the fact that a true mountain of gold does not exist in the world, has never existed in the world, etc. But your ability to come up with that as an idea is proof positive of the fact that you can take the sort of sense impressions that make up your understanding of gold and mountains, smash them together, make gold mountain. Therefore, if you're doing that while you're awake, then of course your mind, which what we understand from science now is that sleep is largely a matter of recuperation. So a lot of what Socrates says about death and what if it's like a deep sleep where you don't dream about anything, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of like, well, the recuperative elements of sleep are certainly good. I don't know if they're necessarily good in themselves, in the sense that they're not a good for you while you're sleeping, or in other words, you don't experience the good of sleeping consciously while sleeping. You only can consciously experience those effects while you're awake, and therefore it's sort of something that you do, and deliberately your conscious experience is not having that of really experiencing the benefits of sleep during the sleep itself. Therefore, if your sleep never ended, would you experience the benefits of it? Maybe, and actually maybe I'm being closed-minded. Maybe the kind of experiential nothing of that death would, like Socrates implies, potentially be a positive. I don't even want to rule that out, because that's judgmental for no good reason. But again, I'm just trying to point out that dreams could theoretically come from anywhere. You know what I'm saying? Like, so many people have so many different dreams, and frankly, the attempt by any individual to try and determine where their individual dreams come from is, I think, the height of lunacy. It's just, it's searching for a needle in a haystack. You're going to be looking all over the place, and then fundamentally, from an ideological perspective, you've got the Plato's Meno problem. In other words, once you find knowledge, how do you know you have it? I found the correct interpretation of my dream. Oh, did you there, Einstein? Please tell me what the correct interpretation is, and how you know a correct interpretation from an incorrect interpretation. And if you don't, fuck your dream interpretations. I don't want to hear it, because it's intellectual, nonsense. It's gibberish. It's akin to religious people speaking in tongues. It's the sort of thing that intellectually we have to discourage, because it's essentially stupid people acting like barnyard animals herded together and mooing in chorus with one another. Like, we're not fucking cows. We're human fucking beings, and we need to be better. I'm letting my frustration fly, because to have somebody like Socrates engaging in dream interpretation genuinely upsets me, because I feel like he should know better. But again, an interesting point to note, why is he doing this? Arguably, according to the text, he says to satisfy my conscience. So, I mean, at least he gives it up here where he says, this isn't this isn't the most rational thing I've ever done in my life. This is satisfying sort of my moral or ethical considerations that are coming to be in sort of my experience, where they're in sort of his daimonic sense. What you would say is, if his conscience is needing to be satisfied, that implies he's not doing something that he should be doing. Because again, his daimon doesn't push him to do anything in particular, although we're about to see some sort of message is certainly pushing him to do something. But you could say it's his daimon making him feel uncomfortable with the sitting still of it all, and essentially sort of the anxiety of the situation sort of prompting him to get active in a way. And now you could say, like, he's been locked up. Maybe if homie could spend an hour in the weightlifting yard of the prison, get some energy out, he might feel a little differently. But it's important to note that he's satisfying his conscience, and he's pointing out, certain dreams satisfy my conscience, frequently bidding me to practice this kind of art. Dreams something like this. Same dream often came to me in the past, so big note of that there. Like, this dude's been having freaky dreams for a long time, which, again, this is why I said it's not judgmental to say Socrates may have had either an epileptic condition or something, because again, these things are in need of an explanation. And when we're thinking about an Occam's razor, like, before we sort of grant the possibility that the god Apollo himself has blessed Socrates with wisdom, and he is, participating in the Apollonian tradition of, the Oracle of Delphi and all these other people, and, before we go that far, maybe we can do something simpler and say there's something about Socrates himself in terms of his neurodivergence of some kind that may be causing all this. And I think it's worth flagging at this point. And then so the dream, what it says is, Socrates had said, practice and cultivate the arts. So again, kind of like the laws talking to him in Phaedo, he's letting the dreams speak metaphorically to him. Now, is this his daimon? Is it something separate from the daimon? This does not make that clear. I'd love to know what the word "it" is in the Greek, but whatever it is that it said, says practice and cultivate the arts. And so what Socrates says is that he's been interpreting this as, that it was instructing me to do what I was doing, which is kind of funny to see Socrates casting himself in the Euthyphro role, where his sort of divine special knowledge is giving him an understanding that he's doing the right thing, and that the right thing is also what he's doing, in sort of that circular way where, if I'm doing it, then it's right. And if it's right, then I'll do it. Therefore, I did it. Therefore, it was the right thing to do. You know what I'm saying? Like, and you don't even have to examine the first part, where it's like, well, what's the logical relation between you doing something and it being right? Please demonstrate that, because that is actually what's in need of demonstration. And so, telling Socrates he needs to practice and cultivate the arts, and then him sort of saying, well, I thought I was doing that, Bill Bob. I've been doing my philosophy. Isn't that art? And then you could argue Socrates is basically getting nervous that he's been misinterpreting this for some reason, which again, is that a sign of a guilty conscience? Is that taking it too far? I don't know. But then to roll on to the end of the paragraph, he says, I thought it was basically encouraging me like a runner in a race, bidding me to practice the art of philosophy because it's the highest art, and I was doing it. But after the trial took place, festival of the god was preventing my execution. So I think Delos is also a sacred island of Artemis and Apollo, I believe. So sacred islands, Tenedos, Delos, etc., etc. But anyway, so Festival of the God preventing the execution, thought that the dream was bidding me to practice a popular art, or he says basically, I thought that in case my dream was bidding me to practice this popular art, I should not disobey, but compose poetry. So clearly the popular art that we're referring to is poetry. And he says, I thought that in case. So that's hedging, that Socrates saying he doesn't know. And what he doesn't know is, am I doing the right thing? Am I practicing the right art or not? So he starts practicing the popular art, which is composing poetry, which we should linger on that a bit, because again, Plato's Socrates in Republic is going to banish the poets from his city and yada, yada, yada. And so you could argue it's like, oh, well, like, the popular art poetry, why was Socrates wasting any of his time on that? But he doesn't want to disobey what his dream may be telling him. And then what's important to note is that for the ancient Greeks, poetry, which I believe the word is poesia or something like that, but the word poetry in ancient Greek is not our modern term of poetry, and we cannot conflate the term poetry with the Greek term poetry. So when I say poetry here, we're talking Greek poetry, capital P poetry. And what we mean when we're talking about capital P poetry is we're talking about the fundamental concept of making almost anything whatsoever. For the Greeks, their term poetry, I believe the word quite literally referred to the kind of to make sort of idea, the idea that it is making in its most generic or broadest form. In other words, all the arts are various forms of poetry. And that poetry is sort of this broad art from which everything else emerges. And you can see that from a certain mysticism perspective. Certainly philosophy and religion can emerge from poetry, although again, you will eventually have some sort of Socratic figure come up and basically point out that rhyme doesn't imply reason. It just implies an internal structure. It doesn't imply that, or it doesn't imply either logical validity or soundness in the case of any particular argument. But so we got poetry, this popular art, and you can see examples of poetry. You can see, I'm blanking on the name of the lady from Lesbos, and I shouldn't, because she's one of the major poets, and I really wish I could remember her name right now, but I can't. But you have that. You've got other people. You've got Homer, obviously, with his epics, etc. You've got lots of different people composing poetry for lots of different reasons. And again, why is poetry important? Oral tradition of passing down storytelling implies that poetry is important because the rhyme scheme helps the reciter of the poem both remember where they are, understand the rhythm, be able to improvise if need be or if they want to, etc., etc. And therefore, the internal rhyme scheme is, or the rhyme scheme in general, any rhyme scheme, is important as far as poetry is concerned. And we're going to roll down further into this paragraph and start to see that Socrates, or at least Plato's version of Socrates, one of the people starting to throw stones at this sort of elevated concept of poetry. And if you've seen it in any of the screenshots that I've been using as the sort of the album art, so to speak, of these music videos that are the podcast and they go up on YouTube, you'll see that I have a passage which is from Plato's Republic where Socrates essentially rewrites the first book or so of the Iliad and essentially writes it as if it were not poetry to basically point out that when you remove the poetry and the style and all these things, you're often left without much in the way of substance. And again, there really is a lot there in Homer. There's a lot of substance there, but this is an attitude that either Plato himself or Socrates, and then influencing Plato, seemingly did not have the most positive attitude towards poets. And again, is that because every poet's bad, or because poets in general tend to use this sort of rhyming trick to get any sort of nonsense across the way, and then they convince people to believe these things even though they haven't examined them, and if they had, they would understand that those things rhyme more than they reason. But again, we've got sort of a beginning of a taking of sides between philosophy and poetry, but then again, we've also got Socrates, the progenitor of the move to more modern philosophy that starts with Plato, is doing poetry at the end of his life, and that's worthy of note. So then, so rites in honor of the god of the present festival. And then realize that a poet, if he is to be a poet, must compose fables, not arguments. So I'd be interested to see why, or what the word fables is in this, in the ancient Greek, because what Socrates is starting to point out here is poets don't argue anything, and anybody who thinks that a poet is arguing for anything is frankly stupid, unless the poetry was literally an argument in the sense of premises in support of a conclusion. But otherwise, poets don't make arguments. They're not composing syllogisms. They're not using propositional logic. They're not using symbolic logic. They're not interested in that sort of thing. And frankly, what he's pointing out is the rhyme scheme itself is not an argument, and cannot be mistaken for an argument just because it's structure. And so here, we can sort of start to understand the difference between structure or schema and true arguments, and there's no need to confuse them, because yes, an argument is a schema, but not all schema are arguments, and so we're going to continue to roll. I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but so I'm going to actually pop on the computer real quick, because I am interested to know who this Aesop figure is, because I just want a little bit of background, because again, my first thought was barnyard animal, goat, something like that, which who knows if that has anything to do with Aesop whatsoever. Again, I think it's because I'm remembering something of a rustic theme to Aesop's fables. But again, so Socrates knows these stories, the fables of Aesop. And again, these fables are not arguments, and so he starts taking them and making poetry. I don't care about bucking soap. Oh my goodness. This is what's wrong with Google these days, is you look up Aesop and they think you're looking for a product. I'm sorry, I'm on an intellectual journey, not a shopping expedition, you fucking moron. Jesus, I have to look up Aesop and then say Greek. This is what's wrong with society these days. Too much materialism, not enough intellectual activity, broadly speaking. And now I have a still image while my computer's frozen. Thank you, net neutrality. Okay, there we go. Okay. Created Aesop's fables, so for this one, we're not doing anything too friggin' complicated. We are going straight to Wikipedia, and we are just going to read the entry there really quickly. But just to go over the end of this paragraph again, and actually we may stop right here since this is taking long enough, but again, telling of Venus, bid him farewell, tell him if he's wise to follow me as soon as possible. Again, that's really loaded, and, alright, now we got the Aesop page open, though. Greek fabulous, storyteller, credited with a number of fables now collectively known as Aesop's fables. Existence remains unclear, no writings of him survive. Numerous tales credited him, gathered across centuries. Many of the tales associated with him are characterized by anthropomorphic animal characters, so that's why I was thinking of barnyard animals. Jeez. Scattered details of Aesop's life found in ancient sources, including Aristotle, Herodotus, and Plutarch. Again, this is why philosophy is important. If you don't care about it, philosophy is a source for history, and just looking at Plato and Aristotle. But an ancient literary work called Aesop's Romance tells an episodic, probably highly fictional version of his life, including the traditional description of him as strikingly ugly slave who by his cleverness acquires freedom, becomes an advisor to kings and city-states. Older spellings of his name have included Aesop and Aesop. Depictions of him in popular culture of the past 2,500 years included, blah, blah, blah. So, what's important here, I would say, stories, anthropomorphic characters, animals, numerous fables, don't have existing material from them. Depicted as a strikingly ugly slave would be, I think, possibly sort of a comparison between him and Socrates, in the sense that Socrates is often depicted as a satyr, and his ugliness is essentially we'll get to it if we get to Symposium, but people were not nice about that, which is a little bit of a dick for saying that about Socrates. But anyway, so somebody says, it's not known whether Aesop actually existed. Earliest Greek sources, including Aristotle, indicate was born around 620 BC in the Greek colony of Mesembria. A number of later writers from the Roman imperial period say he was born in Phrygia. Somebody calls him the Sage of Lydia, so is he from Africa, Greece, wherever the hell? Who cares? By Aristotle and Herodotus, we're told he was a slave in Samos. Slave masters, a man named Xanthus, blah blah. Must eventually have been freed, since he argued as an advocate for a wealthy Samian. Met his end in the city of Delphi. Plutarch tells us Aesop came to Delphi on a diplomatic mission from King Croesus of Lydia, that he insulted the Delphians, that he was sentenced to death on a trumped-up charge of temple theft, that he was thrown from a cliff, after which the Delphians suffered pestilence and famine. Well, before this fatal episode, Aesop met with Periander of Corinth, where Plutarch had him dining with the 7 sages of Greece, sitting beside his friend Solon, who he met in Sardis. Leslie Kirk suggests Aesop himself was a popular contender for inclusion in the list of 7 sages. So, I mean, I'm going to start calling bullshit on this guy's historicity really quickly, because, I mean, among other things, they're saying that he's part of Croesus's mission to the Delphic Oracle, which, who knows whether that happened, but the idea that he met that guy and Periander of Corinth, and I think I mentioned Periander of Corinth in the last episode as the tyrant of Corinth, but whatever. But again, I don't think there's any, first of all, using Herodotus as a source and claiming that therefore we know something about the historicity of who went on diplomatic missions for King Croesus of Lydia is bullshit. We can't take Herodotus that seriously, even though there are things about him that you have to take seriously because he's one of the original sources, but he is not the best historian. I mean, seriously. But anyway, so The thing about King Croesus of Lydia is he had interactions with Solon when Solon was out of Athens for whatever reason. He famously sort of asked Socrates, or asked Solon, who was the happiest, or who was the most fortunate, whatever. And then Solon basically irritates him by telling two examples of these Greek heroes who basically died in the best possible state for themselves. Two of them were like Olympic athletes who basically tie the fucking ox cart to themselves and drag their mother to the Olympic Games because she needs to be there or something, and then they die upon arrival, but because they were so excellently doing the thing they were supposed to be doing at that moment, they die in the perfect state and die in a state of you die. Again, to say that the Greeks were strange people is an understatement, but these are the things that these people friggin' believed about themselves. So again, these are sort of things about Aesop's fables, and then Aesop's romance is allegedly sort of about his life, and honestly, who the fuck cares about that? We're gonna move right on to the fables. Oh, great. Aesop may not have written his fable. This is irritating. God damn it, Socrates, you're pissing me off by wasting my time, but alright, Aesop's romance claim he wrote them down, deposited them in the library of Croesus, which again, just to point this out, super rich and powerful guy who, in the Herodotus telling of it, basically, he's as rich as can be, the first guy coining currency, all these sort of things, and then he's defeated by the Persians, rise of the Persians, fall of the Lydians, etc. So Herodotus calls Aesop a writer of fables. Aristophanes speaks of reading Aesop. That may have simply been a compilation of fables ascribed to him. Sophocles in a poem addressed to Euripides made reference to North Wind and Sun. Socrates, while in prison, turned some of his fables into verse. This is exactly what we're talking about, of which Diogenes Laertius records a small fragment. Is there an actual link to that? No, there isn't. Okay. Oh, wait. He also composed a fable, and it begins, Aesop one day did this sage counsel give to the Corinthian magistrates not to trust cause of virtue to the people's judgment. Oh, brilliant. I mean, if you need any more evidence that Socrates was an anti-democrat, but okay. That was good to read. Earliest Roman playwright and poet Ennius also rendered at least one of Aesop's fables in Latin verse, at least two lines of which still exist. Let's see if we can open that, but collections of what were claimed to be his fables, transmitted by a series of authors writing in both Greek and Latin. Continue to be revised through ensuing centuries. Seems these were written down, and well, who knows when they were written down. I'm not even going to waste time speculating on that, but it seems like during the 1st century CE there should have been copies of it. Yeah, I'm going to just read this last paragraph. Aesop's fables continue to be revised and translated through the ensuing centuries with the addition of material from other cultures to the body of fables known today bears little relation to those Aesop originally told. Excellent, with a surge in scholarly interest beginning towards the end of the 20th century. Some attempt has been made to determine the nature and the content of the very earliest fables, of which may be most closely linked to the historical Aesop. Good luck to those people. Physical appearance and the question of African origin. So the person who wrote it, Aesop's Romance, the anonymous author, writes him as pot-bellied, misshapen of head, snub-nosed, swarthy, dwarfish, bandy-legged, short-armed, squinty-eyed, liver lift and a portentous monstrosity, which that's not exactly engaging in all the sort of modern anti-black stereotypes of, pointing out nose shape and skin color and this, that, and the other, because I don't think short-armed and bandy-legged is what we typically think of when we're talking about somebody who's African or of African origin. But I guess liver lift, if that basically means big lift, then that's potentially a sign of that, but or something similar to that. But so 4th century text says Aesop was laughed at and made fun of, not because of his tales, but on account of his looks and sound, his voice. Again, these are sort of things that are similar to Socrates, so interesting then that Socrates was using these and we haven't even gotten to the damn fables, which we might have to click on that, but a much later tradition depicts Aesop as a black African from Ethiopia. Byzantine scholar from the 13th century conjectured Aesop may have been Ethiopian given his name. The derivation of Aesop from Ethiopia. But this is apparently etymologically incorrect according to Gert John van Dijk, whoever the hell that is. Alright, they say that account is worthless, and then they're basically saying the idea that he was Ethiopian, supported by the presence of camels, elephants, and apes in the fables, even though these African elements are more likely to have come from Egypt and Libya than from Ethiopia. Again, this is sort of stupid, so we're not gonna worry too much about this. Yeah, that's not worth worrying about. Okay, so, I mean, basically, no offense, if you're gonna have it be a stumbling point for you for one reason or another that Aesop was potentially black, then you be you with your racism, but I'm gonna just move on because it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot there. Depictions. Again, I want to see the fables, so we're going to go to Aesop's Fables article because that seems much more important. So, collection of fables, stories associated with him descended in modern times through a number of sources, continue to be reinterpreted through different verbal registers and in popular as well as artistic media. Part of the oral tradition, so not collected until about 3 centuries after Aesop's death. Alright, sorry about the pause. I guess we're gonna have to probably wrap up on these points, but just to sort of look through this article really quickly. So first of all, it's an oral tradition, so that's probably what Socrates is making use of. So I guess these must be just stories that are so well known. Because are these for children or? Let's see. So initially the fables were addressed to adults and covered religious and social and political themes, also put to use as ethical guides for the education of children. Okay. Apollonius of Tyana, 1st century CE philosopher, recorded as having said about Aesop, like those who dine well off the plainest dishes, he made use of humble incidents to teach great truths, and after serving up a story, he adds to it the advice to do or not do it. Then, too, he was really more attached to the truth than the poets are, for the latter do violence to their own stories in order to make them probable, but he, by announcing a story which everyone knows not to be true, told the truth by the very fact that he didn't claim to be relating real events. So, that's interesting. That probably, again, is a 1st century CE philosopher, probably informed by the opinions of Plato on poetry and As we saw Socrates say himself, a poet, if he is to be a poet, must compose fables, not arguments. And so, taking the fables of Aesop and versifying them. I think so it mentions here Plato wrote in Phaedo, Socrates whiled away his time in prison, turning some of Aesop's fables, quote, which he knew, into verses, nonetheless for two main reasons, because numerous morals within Aesop's attributed fables contradict each other, and because the ancient accounts of his life contradict each other. Modern view is that Aesop was not the originator of all these fables attributed to him. Instead, any fable tended to be ascribed to the name of Aesop if there was no known alternative literary source. Excellent. I guess it's saying that the goose that laid the golden eggs is one of Aesop's fables. I guess I should. Geez, I need to open this article about the Perry Index of this. I'm reading a bunch of bullshit. I frankly don't even know the golden goose story myself, or the golden egg story myself, because it's not the golden goose, it's the goose that laid golden eggs. Had a hen that laid a golden egg every day. Suppose the hen must contain a great lump of gold in the inside. In order to get the gold, they killed her. Having done so, they found to their surprise, hen differed in no respect from other hens. Foolish pair, thus hoping to become rich all at once, deprived themselves of the gain of which they were assured day by day. So, that's a very interesting story. So this is English idiom, kill not the goose that lays the golden egg, sometimes shortened to killing the golden goose, derives from this fable, generally used of a short-sighted action that destroys the profitability of an asset. So, yes, again, and I guess there's an Eastern analog found in Suvanahamsa Jataka, which appears in the 4th section of the Buddhist book of monastic discipline, Vinaya. Okay, so who knows who came up with that idea first, but so sometimes the title is given to later the fables become proverbial. Killing the goose to lay the golden egg, town mouse and the country mouse, I don't know that one. Some fables, young man and the swallow, appear to have been invented as illustrations of already existing proverbs. Other fables also verging on this function are outright jokes, as in the case of The Old Woman the Doctor, aimed at greedy practitioners of medicine. So again, Socrates just kind of came across or used the sort of first fables of Aesop that come across his mind. This also says origins, the contradictions between fables already mentioned, and alternative versions of much the same fable, as in the case of the woodcutter and the trees, are best explained by the ascription to Aesop of all examples of the genre. Some are demonstrably of West Asian origin, others have analogs further to the east. Modern scholarship reveals fables and proverbs of Aesopic form existing in both ancient Sumer and Akkad, so early as the 3rd millennium BCE. Aesop's fables in the Indian tradition, as represented by the Buddhist Jataka tales and Hindu Panchatantra, share a dozen tales in common, although often wildly differing in detail. Some debate over whether the Greeks learned these fables from Indian storytellers or the other way around, or if the influence was mutual. B.E.N. Perry, which, yep, he's the one who created the Perry Index. Excellent, so he must be the scholarly expert on this. Took the extreme position in the book Babrius and Phaedrus that in the entire Greek tradition there is not, as far as I can see, a single fable that can be said to come either directly or indirectly from an Indian source, but many fables or fable motif first appear in Greek or Near Eastern literature are found later in the Pancha, Tantra, and other Indian storybooks, including the Buddhist Jatakas. Although Aesop and the Buddha were near contemporaries, stories of neither were recorded in writing until a few centuries after their death. Few disinterested scholars would now be prepared to make so absolute a stand as Perry did about their origin. So it seems like a follower of Aristotle, Demetrius of Phalerum, is the first person to set out a set of 10 of these Aesops. Simply cataloged all the fables early Greek writers had used in isolation as an example of putting them into prose. Evidence of what was attributed to Aesop by others may have included any ascription to him from the oral tradition in the way of animal fables, fictitious anecdotes, etiological, satirical myths, or possibly even any proverb or joke that these writers transmitted. It is more proof of the power of Aesop's name to attract such stories than evidence of his actual authorship. No copy of this survives. Okay. Further light is thrown on the entry of Oriental stories into, and that word is maybe slightly problematic, but again, the word Oriental that they're using there is meant to describe Asia, generally speaking, although it's kind of an archaic term. Well, further entry thrown on the entry of Oriental stories in the Aesopic canon by their appearance in Jewish sources such as the Talmud and Midrashic literature. Comparative list of these on the Jewish Encyclopedia website, of which 12 resemble those that are common to both Greek and Indian sources, 6 are parallel to those only in Indian sources, 6 others in Greek only, where similar fables exist in Greece, India, and the Talmud. The Talmudic form approaches more nearly the Indian. Thus the fable The Wolf and the Crane is told in India of a lion and another bird. When Joshua ben Hanani told that the fable to the Jews to prevent their rebelling against Rome and once more putting their heads into the lion's jaws, shows some familiarity with some form derived from India. Okay. So there's all sorts of versions. I don't want to waste too much time thinking about the versions of these, but just to go through, I guess, some of these stories that I'm this is getting way too into the details of it for no good reason. I just want to see some of the stories, to be honest, so let's go back. Let's see. Selected fables, there we go. Or, let's see if religious themes. In classical times, there was an overlap between fable and myth, where they had, and especially where they had an etiological function. Don't wanna get too deep into that. Dramatized fables, man. All right, select fables. So, geez, there's a lot of them. I think we're just gonna have to go through this Perry Index and see some of these, but just to read some of these names, I mean, the ant and the grasshopper, the ape and the dolphin, the ape and the fox, the ass and his masters, the ass and the pig, the ass carrying an image, the astrologer who fell into a well. I assume that's about Thales. Yes, it is. Hilarious. Boy who cried wolf. Okay, so, I mean, we don't need to go through all of these, but if you know anything about the boy who cried wolf, then you can we can understand kind of what's going on. All right, this is good because I didn't have that before. Okay. Yeah, don't wanna waste too much time on this Perry Index either. But there's hundreds and hundreds of stories in here. Some of them are as fables. Boy who cried wolf, deer without a heart, eagle and the fox, the frogs who desired a king, the goat and the vine, the lion, the bear and the fox. Weird. But anyway, so this is the source material that he's taking these fables and then he's versifying them. So again, though, arguably he's doing this in a way where he's trying to compose actual arguments, and I'm sure, you take a certain Aesop's fable and Socrates will have a fit about it. So, but let's see. Yeah, we're going to pause there, though, because there's a good amount of material here, and we did a big divergence on Aesop, but I thought it was a good divergence because I literally didn't remember who that person was, and then it's the boy who cried wolf, the dude who came up with some of those stories, so, and that stuff is loaded, but again, I think one of the general points to take away from Socrates, as Plato gives him to us, is that he was exactly the sort of person to question just some random fable that's given to you if the ideas expressed aren't logical or logically consistent or whatever it happens to be. And so, I'm going to pause here because we didn't even... Actually, this is funny. So, in this whole hour plus here, I basically only went through 2 paragraphs, and I think here, though, we're getting a good understanding of sort of Plato and Socrates' attitudes regarding poetry and certain problems with poetry, maybe pointing to a different way poetry can be done, and then it's just interesting to note because it would seem so surprising that Socrates is engaging in poetry. So those things are all worthy of note, but at this point I'm gonna pause here, and so let me get my pen. So for Pod 31 we're gonna come back at we're going to come back at 61C because we're going to want to linger on Socrates' comment to Venus, telling him to follow him as soon as possible. We're going to have to do a potential deep dive. We may need to get into John Locke and a few other things, but there's a lot of important stuff there, and so I would anticipate next time we're probably going to go from we're probably going to stop at 63B or so next time. So next time, basically hoping for get a page or two in, we're essentially going to talk about this sort of attitude and thing that Socrates has about dying, and essentially the responses that come, and then and then right here at 64, Socrates starts to make his argument before him, those people as his judges, about the issue of death and etc. So definitely do want to pause there. But again, for this time, we've discussed in detail the sort of the beginning of Plato's Phaedo. Again, we haven't really gotten too deeply into the ideology or the consequences of his opinion on this matter, that matter, or maybe even sort of the most important ideas that are expressed in this dialogue. And so I think if you were doing a presentation where you were trying to summarize the Phaedo in a presentation or two, you probably would not linger as long as I have on these details. You probably would simply note the sort of conventional, or the conventions of how the dialogue starts in terms of it being testimonial, not a first-person account sort of thing, etc., etc. And then the part about Socrates composing poetry, I just think that people kind of make note of that and then just kind of move on. And what I want to do here is to linger on details like that for the fact that they are relevant and that they have bearing on those discussions to the extent that I think it's really worth the time to deep dive into them. And then potentially at some point later, there might be a reason to essentially go back through the Plato material and give more of a high-level analysis where we start to think about the works more broadly as a whole, and maybe talk about the importance of what Plato is saying. But anyway, that'll be for the future. But for now, that was Pod. What was that? Pod. Yeah, that was Pod30, and so Pod31. So I guess one thing to do here at the end, since we discussed it last time, but I didn't really pose it as a question, and I'm trying to do that as far as having sort of a central question of each presentation to orient myself around, so I can say, over and over and over again, this is the idea that I think is important. This is the one that's going to be emphasized as far as I think it's important, etc. But the question, I guess, for this time would be, do you agree with Socrates' or Plato's version of Socrates here, where he argues after having his chains off, that moment where he argues that pleasure and pain essentially follow on each other, that what's apparently the case about them, that they're the opposites of one another, is only true in the sense that they contradict each other, but not in the sense that they don't follow one another. So even though you can't have them at the same time, the pain follows pleasure, the pleasure follows pain, etc. And don't want to, give too many examples in support of that, because it's not really necessary. I just think if you examine it, you'll see that there's a lot of strength to that argument. And I guess the question would be, do you buy the argument overall? And I would say that I do, but that it has a slightly different consequence than what Plato or Socrates thinks it does, because they're concerned with sort of I just think that if you look at it from the perspective that he will go to in Protagoras eventually, in terms of pleasure properly defined as being, proper calculation, proper weighing of all the various sides of things, etc. That basically he's going to give it up eventually, that pleasure is the good, but his main point to make is that pleasure is not what people typically conceive of it as. And I think on that point you have to grant that to Plato, because as Socrates is demonstrating again and again and again, the average person has such a dearth of understanding, such a inability to sort of abstract beyond their own situation to think about things more generally, that again, these sort of some of the objections that are made against Socrates to say, oh, well, he was anti-democratic, this, that, and the other, so he asked for his fate and he deserved it, etc. Again, not saying that I.F. Stone said that he deserved it, but I think I.F. Stone's reading of the situation is not particularly charitable and is sort of indicative of the sort of investigative journalism gotcha style. But there's a utility to that, and yeah, so as far as what I think, I basically think Socrates is correct, and the only difference is I don't really believe in a sort of everlasting solution to the problem. You just have to view it in a proper way where you say, I have to appreciate taking pleasure as the good without chasing it too directly, because I have to focus primarily on doing good things, and doing what's pleasant should be basically an afterthought. But obviously for a lot of people that's not the case, and therefore raises a question, when you have differently constituted people, what is the just way of ordering a society to maximize the benefits to all of them while also potentially maximizing sort of the opportunities for them as well. But that's just to consider that sort of question. Other opinions, your opinions are obviously welcomed on the subject, and I just like to think that there's something intuitive to what Plato said, and he's basically right that a lot of pleasure does come from the relief from pain, and therefore not to overlook that, but to sort of keep that in sort of a Epicurean framework and maintain that, I think is good. So that's it for Pod 30. Next time we'll be back, Pod 31. All right, thanks.